couple of weeks ago, I had a coffee with Jesus. Now, before you think I'm crazy, Jesus is actually an old acquaintance of mine, back from the days when I was studying economics in university. His real name is pronounced Jesus. He's from Spain. But if you have a friend called Jesus, you call him Jesus, right? Now, he sent me an email asking me if I wanted to catch up after quite some time. And I said, sure, why not? Let's have a coffee in a coffee place called The Daily Bread. So yeah, I had a coffee with Jesus in The Daily Bread. Now, you know how these conversations go, right? After some chit-chat, he asks me, so what have you been up to? What have you been working on? And I must admit, even though that's quite an easy question to ask, I had to scratch the ample hair I have left on my head. And after a few moments of intense silence, I said, well, I think you could call me an entrepreneurial happiness economist. And when I said that, he started laughing. He was like, what? Have you turned into a softie? I was like, now, I kind of get why he said that, because back in the days, I was this guy. You know him, a little bit too brainy, a little bit out of touch with his emotions. But obviously I had changed, and I told him about the encounter I had with the diplomatic representative of Congo back when I was working in the United Nations, who after a meeting stepped up to me and said, Belgium, what do you think of this? I was struck, because at that time I realized that we're all looking for the same. We're all looking for our little piece of happiness, independent of culture, race, age, or religion. And also we're looking for the acceptance of others to be different. I told Jesus about the sheer joy I felt when I started my first company. But I also told him about the sorrow when, after only a few months later, both my parents died, leaving me orphaned and having my startup and their business to manage. Basically, I told him the stories about things that are not in the playbook, things that university didn't teach us. But since then, I was still a little bit of this guy. I wanted a new playbook. So for over 2 years, I immersed myself in the latest science of behavioral economics, positive psychology, cognitive science, and even some parts of medicine, because I wanted to understand how economics and happiness, how they link together. And that journey brought me here today. I'm coordinating an initiative called Happonomy, which can be described as a movement of entrepreneurs, creatives, scientists, and technologists who all believe that happiness and economics are not mutually exclusive. We organize lunches, workshops, we execute scientific research, and we also make some noise like I do today. Now, I'm sure you can find a story that tells how difficult it is to properly combine happiness and economics. I could tell you plenty of stories. Let me tell you the story of Dan Price. Dan is an idealist entrepreneur, and at a certain moment in time, he decided to give his employees a minimum wage of $70,000, only to find himself left by his own management and sued by his brother, who was also a part of the company. I could tell you the story of Martin Shkreli. Maybe you know the guy. He's a bit of the poster boy of capitalism gone wrong, what he did, he distributes a medicine, and at the moment he has the license to it, he raises the price 50-fold, only to find himself in US Congress having to explain himself. Closer to home, I could tell you the story of an acquaintance of mine who doesn't speak to his own brother and sister anymore because of inheritance issues. I'm sure you can find a story close to you that actually shows how difficult it is to properly balance economics and well-being. And if we want to understand what's happening here, we need to ask ourselves 2 questions. The first one is not a sexy one. It's, why do we have an economy in the first place? Well, there's a lot of fancy talk being told about economics, right? But at the core, economics is simple. We need a system to exchange value between each other. I have something you want, you give me money, I find money valuable, we exchange it, done. Nothing spectacular. If you felt your heart beating a bit faster, you're either an economist or you should see a doctor. So value, but the question that stems out of this is a much more interesting one. It's probably the most important question we can ask ourselves in our entire lives. It's, what do we find valuable? Now, if I'd ask this, chances are you may say, well, I find happiness valuable or success. But if I'd ask, so what does that mean? Chances are you won't have a concrete answer because we don't give it that much conscious thought. Luckily, scientists have thought about this, and long story short, there's 21 pieces to the puzzle, 21 things that drive the quality of our lives. I'm not going to go into the 21, obviously. The good news is you can bundle them into 5 large groups. The first one, simple, we want to survive, I hope. Second is already more interesting. We want to feel at ease, even though we're all insecure beings. Number 3, we want to connect. We value social relationships. We also want to grow. We want to get the best out of ourselves. And we also finally, last but not least, we want to contribute to something bigger. We want to let go. Now, I could end my story here because if you're wondering why people today are feeling left behind, stressed out, and increasingly frustrated, it's because we have crafted a system that does not truly support what we want. I want you to let that sink in for a second. One of our most important systems to drive our society and our well-being forward has been devised in a way that does not deliver what you and I exactly are looking for. Now, I'm from Belgium, so I'm used to a healthy dose of surrealism. After all, we invented the Smurfs. But even to me, that's just bananas. And we take a look at the 2 main components of our system, work and money, things become quite clear. Let's start with work. If I'd ask you, why do you go to work? Chances are you may say, well, I go to work to pay for the bills. And that's obviously true because we have linked money and work together, and the security that comes out of the money as well. But there's also 3 other reasons why we go to work, and I already told them because I link back to what we are looking for. We also go to work to connect. We like to have a talk over a coffee about the latest episode of Game of Thrones with our colleagues. We also go to work to grow. We like to have a job that challenges us, where we can learn things and where we can apply our talent. And we also go to work to let go, to contribute to something bigger, to the mission of the organization. Now, the problem with today's system is that we have overemphasized the individual growth part, the efficiency, the competition, but we have forgotten about the security part. Our current system is increasingly incapable of providing us the security that we're all looking for. And at the same time, we have thrown connection and transcendence under the bus. And the symptoms are abundantly out there. A recent survey showed that over here, 50% of people expect to burn out during their lifetimes. That's either you or your neighbor. Over the last 10 years in the EU alone, well, the number of people who have been working but are still poor, and the number of people who just cannot find a job for quite some time, even though they have been looking quite well, has increased by almost 1/3. So let's say the alarm signals are there. Now, up to the second part, money. Money is not neutral, and this was going to be the pinnacle of my talk, because I planned to rip a note of 500 euros in front of your eyes. I actually have it with me. It's this, look, a real one. To show you that money is not neutral, that you'd feel something, that you would be like, what is this guy doing? But the problem is, my wife's a lawyer, and she told me yesterday it's actually illegal to do so. So I'm going to leave the honor to not be the first person to commit a crime on the TEDx stage. I'm going to leave that to somebody else. But the point I want to drive home is that money is not neutral. It impacts our happiness, our motivation, even our health. That's because our system is debt-based and scarcity-based. It seems that we don't have enough money, right? Now, the examples that illustrate that this has an impact on our biology and psychology are abundantly out there. Let me give you a couple of examples. In Europe alone, over the last 10 years, over 10,000 people have committed suicide because of financial problems. A study from South Carolina shows that students with large amounts of student debt, that they performed cognitively worse than those who don't have this debt. And the most striking one to me was the research from researchers from Stanford and Berkeley that showed that toddlers of not even 2 years old, that their memory is impacted negatively, that their language development is hindered. So basically what this shows is that our current system, it causes brain damage. Now, you may wonder, where does that leave us, right? I mean, it sounds like we're stuck in a system where people have to work more and more to achieve less and less, and at the same time, you have this big bag of debt on our backs. Well, the good news is that it's going to be our generations that have the ability to choose whether we're going to deploy economics and technology for the sake of our well-being, or whether we're going to sacrifice our happiness for the sake of economics. And there's plenty of solutions out there. We don't need a revolution, and I'd like to provide you 4 types of solutions. The first one, we can reset the place we give work in our lives. I want to do a very short survey here. How many people have checked their work email today? It's a Saturday. Let me see some hands. I already see quite some. And how many have checked their work email during their last holidays? Come on, don't be shy. Even more. Now, can you imagine that a company would forward and delete your emails from your inbox when you're on a holiday? You would have 0 reason to still check them. And as an added bonus, when you'd come back, well, no emails waiting for you. This may sound improbable, but that's exactly what a company like Daimler does today. So it's basically an email policy with a software feature. Solution number 2. We can upgrade our monetary system. Obviously, this is going to take time, but we can get rid of this debt monster. And we can start today by using the complementary currencies that are popping up everywhere in the cities we live in. We could take an example of Croatia, a country that said to its 60,000 poorest citizens, you don't have to pay your utility bills anymore, you don't have to pay your taxes anymore, because they knew, the government knew that these poor people wouldn't be able to pay it back anyways, and it caused troubles in the organizations involved. Or we could step out of the box. Can you imagine that a doctor would say to a patient, look, your loan, you don't have to pay it anymore because I noticed that you have an overdose of stress from it. Can you imagine a system where doctors prescribe debt relief for medical reasons? Solution number 3, we can use our rewards. I'm talking about wages, I'm talking about bonuses, to make sure that all reasons why we go to work are restored. And it could be as simple as being transparent about how much we earn. If organizations are transparent about this, studies have shown that the differences between the wages become smaller. So it's a kind of social correction. And if you want to take it a step further, you can link the lowest wage with the highest wage. If the CEO gets a raise, so does the entry-level employee. Don't get me wrong, I don't want to make a plea for communism, far from. People don't want equality, people want fair inequality. And if you're wondering what's fair, will it surprise you that there's a scientist who actually studied this already? An interesting study from Dan O'Reilly showed that in Denmark, it's a coefficient 2. And in Taiwan, it's a coefficient 20. So it means that it's culturally determined. Now, I realize that the majority of the solutions I've provided are mainly related to work and money and people who can impact this. I'm talking about HR managers, CEOs, entrepreneurs, politicians. But there's one solution that everybody can work with. It's the most important, but it's also the most difficult. We can upgrade the perspective we have on work, money, and happiness. And I'd like to leave you with 2 invitations. The first one is I would like to invite you to think really hard what gives color to your life. See how money and work impacts this, and have the courage to decide for that increases your quality of life, and not necessarily only the numbers on your bank account. And finally, I'd like to ask you to dare to speak up, because it's only by speaking up that we will be able to upgrade a system as important as our economy. Discuss about this with your friends, family, colleagues, even your boss. Because if we have enough voices, we can cure capitalism. And one day, we will be able to wake up in a world that puts happiness first. That's all I had.